Hello fellow Dungeon Synth enthusiasts, or anyone who's happened to stumble across this video. My name's Paul and I'm the man behind the artist Caliginous Empire. I'm releasing my debut EP Gloomlands in November 2020 and I thought I'd do something a bit different. I wanted to do kind of a behind the scenes video to give my EP some context, share a little bit more about my journey with music and how I ended up creating this EP, and I wanted to give some insight into my recording and creativity methods behind the songs. A lot of what I've experienced over the past 9 months or so being part of this subculture is that artists often act under a veil of secrecy and aren't really public, which is kind of a big part of the ethos and mystery that surrounds the genre. I thought I'd try and be as open and honest about myself as I can, making this more a modern way of doing things with the rise of online media such as YouTube, Instagram and streaming services. So if you do enjoy the mystery within the genre more than the openness, then this video likely is probably not for you. So anyway, here we begin. I'm Paul and I'm from Essex in England. I started my musical journey when I was very young, playing violin in primary school up until around age 12, but kinda lost interest as I went into adolescence. I've grown up being a big fan of Michael Jackson and Duran Duran and came from a very musical background, with my dad being the frontman in a really successful pop rock group who gigged across Europe and the US with the Beach Boys, so I was always around music from a really early age. My dad pushed me to play guitar through my youth and naturally I rebelled. I was around 15 at school when I found a group of friends who introduced me to heavy music. New metal was kind of all the rage at the time, and as I got into skating, I got into popular bands like Linkin Park, Slipknot and Iron Maiden. I vividly remember excitedly queuing up for Slipknot's new album, Iowa, on release day. This is when I finally picked up and started playing the guitar. I remember my friend teaching me the first riff I'd ever learned, which was South of Heaven by Slayer. And as I went into college in 2003, I fell in love with what I can only say is my favourite band of all time, Poison the Well, and their album You Come Before You, which is also my favourite album of all time. Soon after I started college, I joined a band with my closest friends with a big influence from bands like Funeral for a Friend, The Used and Thrice. Wanting to take my guitar playing further, I moved to London in 2006 to study at the Institute of Music, where I gained a high national diploma in modern music performance with an equivalent of a grade 8 in guitar. Upon my return from uni, I decided to take my music a lot more seriously. I contacted an old friend and we formed the band Tides of Virtue, taking influence from bands such as Unearth, Partway Drive and the Black Dahlia Murder. We went on to write 2 EPs and a full album, as well as tour the UK and Europe. Having my band's CD in the biggest record store in the UK and having one of our music videos on the metal TV channel Scuzz will always be a huge achievement for me in my life. The thing is, I spent every spare moment I had for 4 years either in the studio recording or practicing, writing music at home, out on tour and also gigging, and this was on top of my 40 hours a week work. It got to the point where I was just burnt out physically and mentally, and hadn't even been away on a holiday with my wife for nearly 4 years. I had to think about my own mental health and ended up just giving up just before the release of our second album. It got to the point where I didn't even want to listen to music anymore. Fast forward 8 years and we entered the COVID lockdown in the UK in March 2020. I was scrolling through some Instagram stories one evening and saw a mate Sam from my old band days had shared Old Sorcery, Realms of Magical Sorrow to his story. The 15-second I heard, I was hooked. I laid there and listened to the whole record right there and then with pure nostalgia. It reminded me of old school RPG games that I played as a youngster like EverQuest, Zelda and Final Fantasy, and transported me into a completely different headspace. So I reached out to Sam and asked him, what was this music? And he said, well, it's Dungeon Synth. I'd never heard of it before. He told me to check out Bergtagen by Ornator Pet, Way to Avalon by Malfet and Winterstead by Guild Law, and it blew my mind. This music resonated with me so much and I couldn't believe I'd never heard of it before. I loved the way the melodies unravelled and how things could go from a pure peaceful soundscape to like an epic battle scene in my head. So after many evenings on Google, reading up about the genre, I joined the Dungeon Synth cult group on Facebook and had a few conversations with its members, looking for new music and reading up on all things Dungeon Synth. It was here that I learnt about the Dungeon Synth zine. I saw episode 1 had been released and instantly wanted a copy. I messaged Sebastian who creates the zine and ordered my copy and couldn't wait to lose myself in all the content of which was totally new for me. Sebastian is someone who I have regular contact with now and I've asked him many questions on my quest to discover more about Dungeon Synth. He's like an encyclopedia of knowledge in the genre, so thanks for entertaining my nonsense. I've never identified as really listening to black metal, and the nearest I came to the genre was enjoying Cradle of Filth's cover of Iron Maiden's Hallowed Be Thy Name and watching Until the Light Takes Us in maybe 2012. Which I've been reliably informed isn't massively accurate, but I'm well aware of the impact that black metal's had on the genre of Dungeon Synth. Trying to gain more knowledge, I bought the Mortis book Secrets of My Kingdom and fell into that too and learned about how Mortis was such a great influence on the scene. I only knew him as the guy that dressed up and made industrial music like Parasite God, and I was fascinated to learn about the impacts he's had. I learned about Orang and his huge catalogue of musical content, and watched a ton of his YouTube videos about how he created all of his sounds and absolutely loved Within the Land of My Own Imagination. It was at this point in July of this year, 5 months after falling down this rabbit hole of dungeon synth, that I decided to rekindle my love of music creation and make some music. I wanted to make some music that I really wanted to listen to myself. This is now the part where the musical elite are probably going to hate me. I played basic keys all through uni and saw that synths were a huge part of the sound of dungeon synth, but with the amount of space I have in my home, a 2-year-old daughter and a limited budget, I wouldn't be able to do anything too extravagant. I've used Logic Pro for my ventures previously, and with a bit of help from my studio engineer friend at work, I managed to get some plugins installed, downloaded the full Logic sound library and bought an M-Audio 32-key keyboard as a controller, then got into a YouTube vortex about how to better improve my recordings. I wanted the portability as my time was limited, so I wanted to record on my breaks at work and on the move, and this worked perfectly for me. I still use my Fender Strat when I jam, and my Yamaha THR 10X that I used to record some metal riffs with my Les Paul. So with my MacBook Pro, my little keyboard and a guitar by my side, I went to work on some tracks. I have total appreciation for the purists here, but in order for this to be accessible to me, I really needed a setup that was as compact as possible but also reasonably inexpensive. Fortunately, I had tons of melodies still in my head from my old band days that I could play on the guitar and just needed to transpose them over to the keyboard. Iron Maiden has always been a huge undercurrent in the music I've written. The way the lead melodies harmonise with the bass lines and the use of pleasant sounding third harmonies and dark sounding fourth harmonies had always sounded so musically pleasing to me. I also loved chord progressions ending in plagal cadences, and the stuff I started to write had elements of that all over the place. Most evenings over lockdown, I sat at my desk in my little portable studio and spent hours playing with sounds until I got exactly how I wanted it. I recorded the guitar parts only to play along and work out the melodies on the keyboard and experiment with all the different sounds available to me. And after around 2 months, I finally had 5 tracks ready to be mixed and mastered. Now, onto the concept of my EP. Initially, I had a story in my head, with each song representing a chapter in the story, and already had written 3 chapters. But to cut a long story short, the story just wasn't fulfilling for me. I felt that after listening to so many records over the past 9 months since my inception into the genre, I found I was forming my own stories in my head whilst ingesting this music, and I wanted the listener to be transported into their own world, not just pigeonholed into my story, so I decided to abandon this element. I mean, they may surface at some point in the future if there's ever a demand for it, but I created the final 2 tracks of the EP with the story in my mind, but not written down. So, here I am, 9 months later, my head's full of knowledge I never thought I'd have, sunk deep into a genre I never knew existed, and with a cassette player just arrived as I await the delivery of my first dungeon synth tape, Malfet's new album, Albanathan. This year has been a wild one with the pandemic, and I honestly think my reignited passion for music, and in particular finding dungeon synth, has honestly helped me through this tough time during this period. Being able to escape the bad things in life as well as focusing on something that I'm really enjoying has been a godsend for me. And with that, I'll leave you all alone now, but thank you for listening to my story, and hopefully you'll give my EP a listen on the 5th of November when it's released.